The fall of the Roman Empire. What really happened? In the year 476, a teenage boy in Italy lost his job. His name was Romulus Augustulus, and his job title was Emperor of Rome. A barbarian general named Odoacer walked into the imperial palace, took away his crown, and sent the imperial regalia all the way to the emperor in Constantinople. Many history books will tell you that this is the moment the Roman Empire fell. But did one of the greatest empires in history really collapse in a single year, or even in a single day? In this video, we're going to look at what actually caused the fall of the Western Roman Empire, how it really unfolded over several centuries, and why it still matters today. When most people hear the fall of Rome, they imagine something simple. A mighty empire, overrun by barbarians, collapsing overnight and plunging Europe into the Dark Ages. The real story is much more complicated. First, there wasn't just one Roman Empire. By the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, the empire was effectively split in two: a Western Roman Empire, with capitals like Milan and later Ravenna, and an Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital at Constantinople. In 476, only the western half falls. The eastern half, which we usually call the Byzantine Empire, keeps going for almost another 1,000 years, until 1453. Its people continued to call themselves Romans. So when we talk about the fall of Rome, we're usually talking about the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, not the end of Roman civilization everywhere. And even that fall wasn't a single moment where everything stopped. It was a long, messy process that involved political chaos, economic trouble, military crises, and massive movements of people, all interacting over time. To understand why the Western Empire fell, we have to look at both internal weaknesses and external pressures. Let's start inside the empire itself. For a long time, the Roman Empire was remarkably stable. From the 1st century to the early 3rd century, it enjoyed what historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. There were wars on the frontiers, of course, but the central government was strong, the borders relatively secure, and the economy vibrant. By the 3rd century, that picture begins to change. One major problem was political instability. There was never a clear, formal rule for how an emperor should be chosen. Emperors could adopt heirs, appoint co-rulers, or be succeeded by relatives, but in practice, power often went to whoever controlled the strongest army. In the 3rd century, things spun out of control. The empire saw dozens of emperors in just a few decades. Many ruled only briefly before being assassinated or overthrown. Generals marched against each other, proclaiming themselves emperor and dragging the empire into repeated civil wars. Every civil war meant wasted resources, destroyed crops, and armies that were too busy fighting each other to defend the borders. The constant turnover at the top weakened people's trust in the government and made long-term planning almost impossible. At the same time, the empire faced serious economic strain. Running such a huge state was expensive. The government had to pay hundreds of thousands of soldiers, maintain roads and fortifications, and support a large bureaucracy. To cover these costs, emperors raised taxes, especially on landowners and cities. Wealthy elites, who had the most money, also had the most ways to avoid paying. They used influence and loopholes to escape some of their obligations. That left a heavier burden on those who were less able to shoulder it. Desperate for revenue, some emperors also devalued the currency, mixing cheaper metals into silver coins. This led to inflation and made people less confident in money. Over time, trade suffered, and the tax system became more oppressive and less efficient. The empire's economy also depended heavily on slave labor. As conquest slowed, the supply of new slaves declined, but the basic structure of the economy did not really change. That made it harder for the empire to adapt when conditions shifted. Another problem was military overstretch. The Roman army was huge, and it had to guard thousands of miles of frontier along the Rhine and Danube rivers in Europe, in Britain, in the Middle East, and in North Africa. Recruiting enough Roman citizens to fill all these ranks became harder over time. The empire increasingly turned to non-Roman soldiers, people the Romans called barbarians. These were Germanic and other foreign warriors who fought for pay, plunder, and sometimes the promise of land inside the empire. Many of these men served Rome loyally for generations, but their leaders gained enormous power. They commanded armed forces that the emperors depended on. Some of them began to negotiate almost as equals with the imperial court. In the late empire, Rome was often defending itself with troops who did not fully share its identity and whose loyalty was sometimes uncertain. None of these internal problems, by themselves, guaranteed the fall of the Western Empire. Rome had survived bad emperors, economic troubles, and foreign threats before. But together, these weaknesses made the empire much more fragile. Then new external pressures arrived on the borders. For hundreds of years, Rome had lived alongside many different peoples beyond its frontiers. To the Romans, these outsiders were all barbarians, but in reality, they were a wide variety of tribes and nations with their own cultures and political systems. Rome fought some of them and defeated them. Others were allies and trading partners. Roman diplomats negotiated treaties, gave gifts to tribal leaders, and sometimes settled entire groups inside the empire as federates, granting them land in exchange for military service. In the late 4th century, this delicate balance was disrupted by the arrival of a new power, the Huns. The Huns were a steppe people who moved westward into Eastern Europe. Their raids and expansion put enormous pressure on the groups already living there, especially the Goths. Around the year 376, a large number of Goths, men, women, and children, gathered on the northern bank of the Danube River, which marked the empire's border. They were fleeing the Huns and asked permission to cross into Roman territory and settle inside the empire. This was not the first time that Rome had allowed an entire people to enter. Roman authorities agreed in principle, on the condition that the Goths handed over their weapons and settled under Roman control. But local Roman officials mishandled the situation badly. They exploited the refugees, overcharged them for food, and failed to provide adequate land or supplies. Hunger and resentment grew. Tension turned into open conflict. The crisis came to a head in 378 at the Battle of Adrianople, in present-day Turkey. The Roman Emperor Valens personally led an army against the Goths. The Romans expected to defeat them as they had many other enemies. Instead, the Roman army was crushed. Valens himself was killed on the battlefield. Adrianople was a shock. An emperor killed in battle by a force that Rome had tried to absorb, as refugees showed just how dangerous the situation on the frontiers had become. It revealed the limits of Rome's power and its failure to manage large-scale migrations. In the decades that followed, the Western Empire struggled to cope with repeated waves of movement and invasion. Visigoths, Vandals, Sueves, Burgundians, Franks, and other groups all moved into Roman territory in different ways. Some came as allies, others as conquerors. Many came as both at different times. Rome tried to deal with them through a mix of war, diplomacy, tribute, and settlement. But the empire now had fewer resources, more internal conflicts, and less flexibility than before. Its old system of controlling the frontiers and absorbing outsiders was breaking down. By the early 5th century, the Western Empire was under severe pressure on almost every front. In 410, the Visigoths under their king Alaric marched into Italy and captured the city of Rome. The city was looted for 3 days. In practical terms, Rome was no longer the main political center of the empire. The government had moved to safer locations. But symbolically, this was enormous. Rome had not been taken by a foreign enemy in nearly 8 centuries. For many people, it felt like the unthinkable had happened. At the same time, the empire began losing crucial territories. In Britain, Roman troops and officials were gradually withdrawn. Local communities were left to defend themselves against raids and invasions with little or no help from the central government. Roman administration faded, and what remained was a patchwork of local rulers. In North Africa, the Vandals established a powerful kingdom centered on Carthage. This loss was disastrous for the Western Empire. North Africa was one of its richest provinces and a major supplier of grain. Losing it meant losing both food for the city of Rome and vital tax revenue for the government. Inside what remained of the empire, political power often fell into the hands of military strongmen, many of them of barbarian origin, who were deeply embedded in the Roman system. Generals like Stilicho and Ricimer commanded mixed armies, and effectively ruled behind the scenes. Emperors became figureheads who rose and fell at the whim of their own generals. These leaders were not trying to destroy Rome. They wanted to control it. But their rivalries and short-term decisions further weakened the central state. In 455, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. They looted the city for 2 weeks and carried off treasures to North Africa. The word vandalism eventually came from this event, although it is an exaggeration of what actually happened. By now, the Western Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its territory was shrinking, its finances were in ruins, and its army relied heavily on allied groups that were increasingly independent. Finally, in 476, the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the barbarian general Odoacer. Romulus was a teenager and more of a puppet than a real ruler. Odoacer did not claim the title of emperor for himself. Instead, he ruled Italy as king and officially recognized the authority of the Eastern emperor in Constantinople, while in practice acting independently. Later historians chose 476 as the symbolic date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It is a clear event, the deposition of the last Western emperor. But for people living at the time, it may not have looked like a single dramatic break. Many aspects of Roman life continued under new rulers. So did Rome fall, or did it transform? The answer depends on where you look. In some regions, like Britain, the end of Roman rule looked very much like a collapse. Cities declined or were abandoned. Long-distance trade shrank. Villas, baths, and roads fell into disrepair. For many people there, life probably became poorer, more local, and less secure. In other areas, such as parts of Gaul, Spain, and Italy, the picture is more gradual and mixed. New barbarian kings took power, but they often preserved many elements of Roman culture. They used Roman law, relied on Roman administrators, and adopted Latin as the language of government. Local elites continued to live in Roman-style homes and to think of themselves as Romans, even under new rulers. Meanwhile, in the East, the Roman Empire continued. The empire based in Constantinople kept calling itself Roman. Its citizens preserved Roman law and imperial traditions, even as their language and culture grew increasingly Greek and Christian. For them, Rome had not fallen at all. Modern historians debate how to describe this era. Some emphasize the real losses, the breakdown of central authority in the West, the decline of some cities, and the disruption of trade networks. They see the fall of the Western Empire as a major collapse. Others focus on continuity and change. They talk about the transformation of the Roman world, a long process in which Roman institutions, Christian religion, and various barbarian cultures blended into the societies of medieval Europe. Both views capture part of the truth. What ended in 476 in the West was not just an empire on a map. It was a particular way of organizing power, taxes, and armies across a vast territory. That system proved too rigid and too fragile to survive the combined pressures of internal weakness and external stress. Why does the fall of the Roman Empire still matter to us today? Partly because it is a powerful story. It shows us that even the mightiest empires are not permanent. It has emperors and generals, battles and betrayals, sieges and sacks of cities. It is dramatic and memorable, but there is also something more familiar in Rome's story. We can see a superpower struggling with the cost of defending long borders. We see political infighting and instability at the top. We see economic inequality, a heavy tax burden, and a population that grows resentful. We see large-scale migrations and refugees seeking safety inside the empire. We see pandemics and climate shifts that put extra stress on a fragile system. History never repeats itself exactly, and we should be careful about drawing simple lessons. The Roman Empire is not a direct model for any modern country. But the fall of Rome does remind us that complex societies can appear stable for a long time, and then change very quickly when enough pressures build up at once. It shows how internal divisions can be just as dangerous as external threats. And it raises questions about how flexible or inflexible our own systems might be in the face of crisis. For people living through Rome's decline, it did not feel like the end of civilization. They were not characters in a story called The Fall of the Roman Empire. They were simply trying to survive, to adapt, and to understand a world that no longer worked the way it used to. Out of that period of crisis came something new kingdoms, new cultures, and eventually a new Europe built on the foundations of Rome. That is the real story of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Not just a sudden collapse in 476, but a long transformation that reshaped the world. If you enjoyed this explanation and want to explore more moments like this, make sure to follow along for more history in just a few minutes at a time.